Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So lovely to be in this space. So grateful for yet another great year at a Chacruna conference. My name is Liana, and I'll be the moderator today. I'd love to start by introducing our esteemed panelists. To my left, we have Maria Mangini, PhD and family nurse practitioner, who has written extensively on the impact of psychedelic experiences in shaping the lives of her contemporaries, and has worked closely with many of the most distinguished investigators in this field. She's one of the founders of the Women's Visionary Congress, a visiting scholar at the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, and professor emerita in the School of Science, Allied Health and Nursing at Holy Names University. To her left, we have Licia Skye, who is co-founder of the Trauma Research Foundation. She is a somatic educator, artist, and body worker who works with traumatized people and trains mental health professionals to use mindful meditation, mediation in movement, theater exercises, writing, and voice as tools of attunement, healing, and connection. And to our left, we have Betty Aldworth. Betty is currently the director of communications for MAPS. She's also the former executive director of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. SSDP, there it is. And Betty was also head of communications for the ballot initiative in the state of Colorado, the very first ballot initiative to create the legal frame for recreational cannabis use in the state of Colorado. Welcome, ladies. It's so wonderful to be with you all here today. So this conversation is very close to our hearts. There has been historically a lack of representation of women in the dominant narratives around the movements of psychedelics and cannabis. And I'd like to kick off this conversation by asking each of our panelists here, in what ways have these movements suffered from the perceived lack of involvement of women in the dominant narratives?
Betty, do you want to start?
I haven't been on a stage in a long time, y'all. There is because so many spaces are historically cis male centered. And let me start with this. We are talking, this is framed around women. However, when I'm referring to women in this panel, in many cases, I am being broadly inclusive to represent essentially non-cis males. And although I feel like we need another term, so if you've got it, shout it out, and I'll try to replace. But most social, political, business spaces are designed from patriarchy, right? And though we all know on this stage, and many of you in the audience, that behind closed doors, in conversation, in a lot of decision-making spaces, though women may have had tremendous influences on decisions that were made, it was men who were able to carry those into the public, into the legislatures, into the boardrooms. And so I think that recognizing that women's lack of presence in that public representation means that our voices are always, historically, were carried through a translator in many ways, probably contributes to a warping of representation in the public eye. One of the things, though, that I have worked on so much in my time in drug policy reform is that the lack of public representation means that women and non-cis men don't feel like they are welcome in these spaces because they don't see themselves in leadership positions, in leadership opportunities, at podiums and in those boardrooms. So it creates a perception that we are not present in shaping this culture and this movement that we're creating together. I think that the more of us who have the safety and privilege to stand up and represent our views ourselves, the better, because it means we bring more and more voices to stand alongside us.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Betty. I'm wondering, Maria, if you want to comment on this question of, are things changing today from where we've been at historically with this representation?
Well, I think that's clear. You know, I'm old, and I've been kind of involved in this area of interest for quite a long time, and so I've had an opportunity to observe the changes over a period of decades. And I think the visibility specifically of women right now is significantly greater, so much so that the organization that I and some of my colleagues started at the beginning of this century that was really focused on creating opportunities for women to participate feels like we can turn our attention to some other aspects of inclusiveness that would be different from that one, because the opportunities for women to be part of research teams, to make presentations at professional conferences, to be included in entrepreneurial activity are increasing all the time. But when I think back to the early history, particularly, I'm thinking a lot about cannabis because there's a lot more, for me, there's a lot more duration of focus on making cannabis a part of what's available in the community. There are some really outstanding contributions that have been made by women, which I think have largely, they may have been noticed at the time that they were being made, but they've largely gone unnoticed since then. And that's sort of part of my, or our new initiative with the Women's Visionary Council, is that we're trying to really make sure that those contributions are not lost to history, and that the lessons that have been learned by those people's activities are going to be informative for us, not to have to relearn them in the future.
I'm wondering if any of you could speak to any of the lifeways, principles, or messages of some of these early historic pioneers that helped pave the pathway and help shape the movement that we find ourselves a part of today.
I could give you a few names. There's Michelle Aldrich, who was one of the people who started CHAMP, one of the first social environments where medical cannabis was available, and in the early days of the HIV epidemic was one of the really well-resourced or well-supported opportunities for people to gather and get not only the use of medical cannabis, but also social services, acupuncture, counseling. Mary Rathbun, whom you might have heard of as Brownie Mary, who was a pioneer in that she recognized that cannabis had the capacity to relieve nausea in a situation where people were literally wasting away, and was willing to go to jail for the opportunity to provide cannabis in that situation. Angel Rach, who took her case to the Supreme Court. Pebbles Trippett, who is an activist in the Humboldt and Mendocino County area, who, you know, she fought the law, and the law won the first time, but not the second time. There are a number of notable women that are part of the history of the cannabis movement who are, many of them are still active today, but I think they're largely unknown.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm wondering if you, Licia, want to speak a little bit on credentials versus life experience and embodied knowing in relation to working in these spaces and the ways that regulations are being rolled out.
It's such a lovely question. Thank you. I'll start by saying that as a person of color, as well as being female, I've always had a fear of walking past no trespassing signs. And I've been around many people who are white and confident that they will not be harmed if they walk past a no trespassing sign. And I've never had that confidence. I've had people look at me and go, "What's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing this?" And so in 2019, when I was invited to be part of the MAPS training, and I have to thank Monica Williams for allowing me to be part of that, it was a huge thing. And it was a huge thing for me, not just because I'm a person of color and a woman. It's also a huge thing because I am not a licensed therapist. I have decades of experience that are therapeutic and years worth of accumulated knowledge that I think therapists should have. And I've been referred to by therapists who don't know how to do the work that I do, embodied awareness, safe touch. Those are things that should be in this space. And licensing is a no trespassing sign for a person like me. It means that when things are becoming legal, I'm probably not going to be legally included. There are many people who work underground and do incredible work who are not licensed, who will probably be excluded from the most mainstream applications publicly. And their skills will not be part of the skill set of the people who are practicing. It's incredibly important for the whole field to understand what those skills are. When people go for a degree in mental health or social work, all the trauma courses are electives. They're not required. There is no requirement for people to understand their bodies as part of their mental health. So it's a big issue. It's not just a big issue for me. I'm the person who is lucky enough, privileged enough to have enough relations with people who are high up in the therapeutic world that they invite me to teach. But there are so many people who have gifts that are so important who are not able to share. And yeah, I guess that's enough.
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's making me think about some of the inherent risks that exist when being visible and working in the field of psychedelics. And I'm curious if you have any comments on any risks that might be unique to women inside of this field. Or, more obvious for women.
Well, I think anybody who has been socially disadvantaged because of their identity has less wherewithal and support in the material world than somebody who has not experienced that. So if they lose something, they have less to lose, and the impact of what is lost it takes a bigger bite out of who they are. But there's also direct, specific things that are, I think, more likely to occur with women. For example, being castigated by the non-custodial parent in a battle for the custody of one's children because of one's behaviors. I think it is more likely that that's going to befall a woman parent than otherwise.
Whenever I'm talking with someone about speaking publicly about their drug use, current, past, or intended future, there must be a significant conversation around the very real risks that most of us face. And because of so many of these social structures that I know I don't have to explain to this audience, there are much greater risks for people who don't have secure immigration status, who are mothers or custodial, or, the more active parent, there are risks to your work that you may experience more profoundly if you are a woman or a person of color. This metaphor of the no trespassing sign it was very moving for me, because I'm embarrassed to say I've never been arrested for civil disobedience. I've only been arrested for trespassing. Truly, the one time in my life this is a very shameful thing for me. I've never been arrested for civil disobedience at a protest, but there's still time. But I look at a no trespassing sign as a suggestion, even as a female-bodied person, because I have enormous privilege that I carry in the world with me. So I can tell people that I am, had a past chaotic relationship with methamphetamine and not be afraid of it. I can tell people that LSD saved my life and not be afraid of it. I'm also not a parent, so I have enormous privilege in all of these ways. So for, many people who have to make a decision between their immigration status or their work or being in close daily relationship with their children, and doing the activism or the advocacy or the speaking that they'd like, it does become a much more difficult question if you aren't as fortunate as I am with being a childless person who's been talking about drugs for 15 years.
Yeah. Something I've learned from you, Maria, and some of the other elders in the space is just this emphasis on just the enormity of the risk that was taken early on and throughout the history of this movement, whereas now so many new people are coming in and joining and able to speak a lot more freely, when in the earlier days it was, a lot more attention was paid toward anonymity and privacy and keeping things, very tightly and carefully held, and that people risked their livelihoods, and mothers risked losing their children to bring healing to people. So this work has been done and is built off of people and women who have taken enormous risks to bring us to this moment today. Yeah. I know Betty and Maria have had this long history of both working inside of the cannabis and psychedelics movement, and I'm curious to hear from you on what your early experience was. I know Betty and I met in the early days of the cannabis industry, and we were constantly in rooms filled with white men in suits, and having these conversations and being in this awareness with one another. And so I'd love to hear, maybe start with you, Betty, a little bit about what that experience was like for you.
Well, I came from a world of direct service and education nonprofits, both of which were very female spaces, right? And so to enter into the cannabis space that was both advocacy with the large national nonprofits and the statewide advocacy groups and the industry into this very male space was nothing short of shocking. And to be unaccustomed to the ways in which men in those spaces sort of felt a right to your body, quite literally sometimes, in far more severe ways than I experienced in that space. But even with like the too long hugs, right? We know those. It's very uncomfortable. And like to have to do that education, like very basic education of like, hey, you don't get to hug me unless you ask, in places where you had very limited power. And I'm not suggesting that we don't experience this today, but it, at the time, was so much more prevalent, particularly coming from where the advocacy space was melding with the business industry in cannabis. but also that manifested in the advertising, in the ways that bud tenders were trained, in the ways that policies might have been written, regulations might have been written that favored the physician over the nurse, right? A typically male profession versus a typically female or historically female profession. And all of those elements in which there was a disregard, I think, of women as cannabis consumers, cannabis cultivators, community builders, and the ways in which we interacted there, and certainly in industry, right? As investors started coming in, and people who had succeeded in business as entrepreneurs, oftentimes men, who had not engaged women significantly in their businesses. So to see that happening in cannabis, it's interesting because it seems somewhat less prevalent in a lot of psychedelic spaces. It seems like we might have gotten through some of that in our practice round with cannabis. That has been, questionably successful. But but to have the to see that, well, I'll say this. When I first started in cannabis, there was really no information available online except on the forums about how to treat your symptoms or your illnesses with cannabis. You had to go to the forums. And every forum was topped with an advertisement for legal buds of a naked, nubile young woman with just some laying on a bed of buds with some buds over her privates, over her bathing suit areas, right? And so every single mom who had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, every single woman who was trying to sort out how to treat her serious illnesses with cannabis was confronted first with that image, reminding her that she was valuable for her body, and that was it in this community. And we don't see that, or at least I haven't seen that in the psychedelics realm, in the ways not quite as blatantly. So at least we are beyond that.
Yeah, thank you. Maria, I'm wondering if there are any ways in which the cannabis movement has failed you or disappointed you.
Well, my social home is in what's popularly known as the Emerald Triangle in northern Mendocino County and Humboldt County. And my community has been devastated by the effects of legalization. What was an industry that indemnified us from many of the problems that rural communities face all over the United States with recruitment and retention of medical personnel, having an adequate amount of broadband service, being able to buy nutritious food in a grocery store. Those things were all supported by the income that was brought in by the cannabis industry, which is really no more. And the clinic in the community where my family makes its home now has to have a grant funding program for people to travel the 60-mile round trip to the nearest big supermarket because you can't buy a full assortment of family groceries in our town any longer. So I think that the outcome of I generally prefer for people not to go to prison because of plants. My sister spent 3 years in the federal penitentiary because of a cannabis violation, so I don't feel so good about that. But I don't think that legalization has done a very good job for our community.
Yeah, please.
I've heard many people express ambivalence about legalization because of how many more young people seem to have access to it, how much stronger it is, all kinds of things. But I'll bring it back to being a person of color again, that because the legal system falls so hard on communities of color, I will never, ever want to see cannabis not be legal. I mean, it's just so devastating. And white people in white communities have not suffered the impact of the laws. And I just, it would be so bad to
There
go
is
back.
no question that that's true. And the difficulty, of course, is that people, sometimes humans are not very smart sometimes. I know that the state of New York, for example, has really tried to set up its legal framework and arrangements to try directly to address that, as it should do. But even that isn't functioning ideally. And I think that sometimes the most aggressive and the most rapacious elements of the community have taken advantage of circumstances that were not necessarily meant to go in that direction.
Yeah, so all of this is making me think about the moment that we're in right now. Some of the first regulations are being written about how to expand access to psychedelics in non-medical contexts. And so I'm wondering what lessons we might learn in this time from the way that the cannabis regulatory space and the industry has unfolded.
Well, I was very naive about capitalism 12 years ago. Really naive about the power of capitalism, and believed that we could both do the incredibly important justice work, the fundamentally most important to me, justice work of not putting people in cages because of cannabis, and allow for the flourishing of business, and that would not, those two things could happen harmoniously. And they didn't. They didn't. Very few conversations around cannabis policy reform or the new state of cannabis in our society are justice-oriented. In fact, it was just 2013, the next year, where you saw the rise of the cannapreneur as this, cultural phenomenon. And everyone was just drawn to the money and the glory of capitalism and cannabis, which meant that we completely lost sight of all of the people who had suffered so tremendously under criminalization. And we cannot, so there are the people who were criminalized as users or as sellers or as otherwise involved in the underground or the unregulated retail side of things, but then also such a loss of knowledge and wisdom for people who had been in relationship as cultivators and breeders for decades and who had learned from elders who had learned from elders. All of that is such a tiny little piece of cannabis today, and let us not allow that to happen in psychedelics. My colleague speaks about creating a harmonious system, a harmonious ecosystem for ending criminalization and allowing space for all of the traditions that we bring, right? Whether that's literal traditions, brought through through cultural lineage, or the tradition of celebration, that we might see in less, in party spaces, frankly, right? Like, let's not lose sight of all of the traditions that weave together to create this psychedelic culture that we live in. And at the same time, let's stop putting people in cages, damn it.
Anyone else?
I looked into what it would take to open a cannabis storefront in New York State when it first became legal. And the buy-in, the cost to buy in to be able to open a storefront is so prohibitive that most of the people who might have had a small operation underground could never afford to participate in what exists now. There's no way.
And this is a place where there has been a clear intention in the law to indemnify the people, particularly in communities of color, that have been most severely affected by the stupid laws that we've had up till now.
So this brings me to this question about what might need to change in the current psychedelic culture and the current psychedelic movement to foster more accessibility and inclusivity moving forward so that we don't repeat these same mistakes of our past.
Go ahead. We could do this as a duet. I think that we really are going to have to unpick some of the regulations that we have in California. And that's a really strenuous agenda to even flirt with, because it was even getting them in place in the first place was a big problem. But the level of unfairness and the susceptibility to, marketplace manipulations that have excluded a lot of people who have real skills and have, like I mentioned Mendocino and Humboldt County, just slightly to the south of where our home is, there's the Napa wine country, where people's relationship to the grape is really respected and honored and valued and compensated. And I would like for cannabis to be treated that way, and for people to appreciate the skills of the people who really can. This is a sensitive plant. The plant will enter into a communication with people who choose to do that, and will respond if you tickle it in a gentle way. And I think those people have learned some things that I would like not to see disappear, because the commercial realm has failed to appreciate them, at least for the time being.
It seems like, oops, I think my battery has died. It seems like legalization has meant that participation is only allowed on an industrial scale, and that that the smaller industries, the cottage industries. I know in Massachusetts, each individual is allowed legally to grow 6 plants. What the heck does that mean? There's no way for regular people who have experience to come into this. No matter how much experience they have, there's no legal way for people who are not like that to come into the field.
At one time, there was a national group that was called the Little Hoover Commission that was going around the countryside looking at professional licensure. And what they were doing was evaluating, like, why do you have to have a license to be a barber? Like, what does that do to, what kind of a barrier to entry to that profession does that present for people who have to expend their resources on getting a specific kind of certification preparation and then pay the licensure fees? And I think there are a great many things in the Consumer Affairs Department of the state of California that are kind of like that. They're supposed to protect the public, but in lots of ways they also protect the territory of the people who are already inside the fence. And I think we're building a similar structure around some of these sacred medicines and practices, which I think is alarming.
I'd love to bring in something that our panelist, Amber Center, who became ill and wasn't able to join today, would certainly say here, which is that in the backlash against DEI that we're seeing across the culture, well beyond psychedelia, and the backlash that we're seeing against DEI in Supreme Court cases and in workplaces is also impacting us, and we must not allow that backlash to interfere with our appreciation for and full inclusion of, people of marginalized identities, no matter what that identity may be. Amber can say that with a lot more information and a lot more eloquence, and so I hope that you'll, look her up online and learn a bit about that. Two other things quickly to bring this back to the topic here of specifically for women in cannabis and psychedelics. And the first is mentorship. If you are not mentoring a young woman in this space now, please fix that as quickly as you can, because we have got to bring young women up in place with powerful mentors who are able to help them thrive and create nurturing environments where they can learn and make mistakes safely and have all of the experiences that those of us who have been through the ringer a couple of times have lived through, with a little bit of insight from us, and have a great coaching. Students for Sensible Drug Policy has an incredible mentorship program called the Psychedelic Pipeline. Check it out. It's amazing. The second thing is we have to recognize that we live in a rape culture, and we have to very specifically, consistently, and with great intention extract rape culture from our day-to-day lives and from our community. We have to hold people accountable. We have to create a culture where assault and abuse and harassment are unacceptable, and people need to go deal with their shit before they're going to be welcome back, right? Now, and obviously this is very complex with shadow work, and Genesee in the panel before said, let us not cancel people, but let us not let people get away with propagating and perpetuating that culture within these spaces, because we have to create safe spaces for women to thrive.
All right, I'd love to invite up any questions if anybody has any. Do you have anything to add, my dear?
I was just going to take the mic down to the audience if there were questions.
Join us up here if you have a question.
If anybody has a question, you can raise your hand. Yes, I see one right here. Come on up to the front, please. Yes, come on up to the front, please.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful conversation. And Betty, I really would like to thank you for mentioning the mentorship. And I feel like there should be more conversation around women supporting other women. As a founder, as an entrepreneur, I noticed that majority of people who support me are men in a good way. And I reached out to many women in these communities previously and been rejected and talked down. And it's a very common practice in not only psychedelic field, but across entrepreneurship in different areas. So I think it is important for women to check with themselves and ask, am I biased towards another woman when it comes to support and help? And I think we should have more conversation around that and support for other women from women. So thank you all for that.
Anyone else?
Come on down, please. And then you're next.
Hi, I'm not really a public speaker, I'm a little nervous, but you said something that spoke to me. As someone who comes from, I guess we call it a legacy background, and who spent the last 10 plus years working in legal cannabis, the last 3.5 for Sal Pace out of Colorado, the former state representative who co-sponsored the first adult use recreational bill. I've taken a year kind of sabbatical from my career. I'm being pulled and called into psychedelic spaces. I'm so disenfranchised from so many of the things that I've seen from legalization of cannabis. I'm very hesitant to re-engage in an industry that can exploit people, marginalize them, and then not even deliver on the promises that they initially spearheaded with, right? So I believe in us, and I believe in our power. I am scared, right? So what advice do you have? Thank you for mentioning the mentorship, being able to give back to my community. But what advice do you have for the women like me who have talent and gifts to offer, and we want to get involved, but we're hesitant?
Oh boy. You know, I'm a midwife. And here in California, when I first started to study midwifery, women were being arrested for practicing midwifery without a license. And that clearly has changed because there was careful and patient work to demonstrate that there were certain skills that people could readily acquire through a traditional breath-to-breath kind of apprenticeship transmission that they did not have to go to school for. And I'm a little concerned about the over-medicalization of some aspects of approaches to psychedelics, because I'm from an era when medicalization was not on the table. And I think I still have enough neurons to function, and I've had a lot of experiences that would be described as unsupervised self-experimentation, which nevertheless provided me with some really profoundly transformative opportunities in my life, and I want to honor that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had 2 home births with midwives, so thank you for that. I appreciate your work. I want to say that if you have skills, a skill set or skills that you want to bring to the table, it's really important to show up and find the people who are looking for what you offer. There aren't a lot of people doing what I do. And it takes courage to show up when you don't see anybody who looks like you or you don't see anybody doing what you're doing. But I'm quite sure that what you have is a very important thing to bring to the table. And when you show up with what you have, there will be people to meet you. I do have mentors. I do have people who've said, wow, that's great. We need this here. Come in, come in. And I hope that you find that. It's important.
Thank you. I just want to add one thing as well with that, which is if you have experience in the externalities and the cost of getting reform wrong, come and help us get this right. We need that kind of experience.
Hi, my name is Dr. Natasha Kalouf, and I'm a licensed cultivator. I'm one of the only female women of color licensed cultivators in the state of California. I decided to walk through the regulatory gates, even though it's been the most frightening thing I've ever done in my life, because I'm a mother of 2. I'm a single mom, and it was important for me to show people like me that we could do it. I'm offering a mentorship this program to help teach urban youth under 25 how to farm. My farm is 50 minutes away from here in southern Sonoma County. And there's a lot of hurdles we are facing, so the one thing I can tell the public is to seek out the small farmer. And it's not just us females that are objectifying our body on Instagram, it's the ones actually doing the work. You can find me out in my field 6 months out of the year. So thank you all. And Maria, I'm a student of Raven Lang's. Okay.
Well, farming, like midwifery, is an ancient skill, and I would very much like to see it flourish and be passed on in the present day.
Thank you so much to our panel. Give them a warm round of applause.